This is my true story. I worked all my life to build a business, a home, and a family I thought would never leave me alone. I gave them everything: money, comfort, and love. But when I got old, they changed. Each time I called, they said, "We're too busy." Birthdays, holidays, even weekends, they forgot I existed. I felt invisible in the house I built for them. But one day, I made one phone call. And a week later, they were standing outside my $5 million mansion, begging for my help. Before I tell you what happened, comment where you're watching from and please subscribe so my story can reach more people. I tried calling them again and again. Days turned into weeks, and every call ended the same way. "We're too busy," they said. "We'll talk later." Later never came. Birthdays passed without a visit. Holidays came and went without a message. They never asked how I was feeling or if I needed anything. The house that once echoed with laughter now stayed silent. I sat at the same dinner table alone, the food cold, the chair across from me empty. I used to look at the phone and wait. Every ring gave me hope. But most days, the phone stayed quiet. Sometimes it would light up with their names and I would smile. But it wasn't a call to check on me. It was a request. They only remembered I existed when they needed something, when it was convenient. I remembered when family meant care, when weekends were for gatherings, when everyone sat together, shared stories, and laughed. Now they have new lives, new priorities, new excuses. Work is busy. The kids have school. "We'll come next month." But next month never came. I would look at the calendar, mark the dates, and wait. Nothing changed. The calls became shorter, the visits stopped completely. I still sent them gifts. I still paid their bills. I still helped when they asked. But the warmth was gone. I was no longer family to them. I had become a number on a bank screen, a name they used to unlock comfort. I had built their lives from scratch, but now they acted like I was a burden. Like time spent with me was wasted time. It broke me slowly, piece by piece. Every night, I sat on the porch, looking at the road, hoping one of their cars would stop in front of the gate. None did. I watched other families walking together, laughing together, eating together. I felt forgotten in my own story. The man who gave everything had become invisible. Even the neighbors asked about my children more than my children asked about me. I tried not to be angry. I told myself they were busy, that life changes, that maybe they would come around. I defended them to others. They work hard. They'll visit soon. But deep inside, I knew the truth. They had time for everything except me. They had energy for everyone except the man who made their success possible. Sometimes I left messages just to hear their voices in return. "Just checking in," I would say. "Hope you're all fine." No one replied. Hours passed, days passed. The message remained unseen. The pain wasn't loud, it was quiet, constant, and heavy. I didn't need much, just a call, a visit, a little reminder that I still mattered. But I was asking for something they no longer cared to give. I began to stop trying. I cooked less, talked less, moved slower. My world grew smaller, limited to my house and the garden. I used to water the plants with joy, thinking one day my grandchildren would play there. Now I watered them in silence, wondering if they even remembered my name. The home I built for love had turned into a place of loneliness. The worst part wasn't the silence. It was the realization that they didn't see what they were doing. They didn't realize how much each ignored call cut me open. They thought time was endless, that there would always be another chance. But old hearts don't wait forever. Still, I didn't hate them. I couldn't. A parent's heart doesn't turn cold easily. I only wished they knew the value of time, the value of love before it was too late. But people don't see the pain they cause until it finds them. And soon, it would. Because no matter how quiet I had become, I still held the power they had all forgotten, the power that built their lives, the power that could take it all away. There was a time when they needed me for everything. Every decision, every plan, every small issue. My phone never stopped ringing. They called me for advice, for money, for guidance. I was the first person they turned to when things went wrong. I always answered, no matter the hour, no matter how tired I was. That was when they still remembered who built the ground they stood on. But over time, the calls became fewer. The messages grew shorter. The words became colder. I noticed the change slowly. They no longer called for help. They called only for approval. They wanted my signature, not my presence. They wanted my money, not my time. When I tried to give advice, they brushed me off. When I asked about their lives, they said they were too busy. The man who once stood at the center of their world was now treated like a shadow. They didn't even realize how much that silence was saying. I tried to remind them gently at first. I would say small things, simple words, hoping they'd notice. Don't forget where you started. Family should stay close. But they didn't listen. They thought success was their own doing. They forgot who paid for their schools, who built their businesses, who stood behind them when they failed. They forgot the long nights I spent working so they could live without worry. The love that once connected us had turned into distance they didn't even see. I watched from afar as they built their lives around convenience and pride. They lived in nice homes, drove expensive cars, traveled often, and posted happy pictures. To the world, they looked like a strong family, but behind the photos was silence. They had replaced gratitude with arrogance. They had replaced care with excuses. They had built comfort on a foundation they never laid. Each time they ignored me, something inside me faded. I no longer saw my children as my little ones. I saw them as strangers wearing familiar faces. It hurt deeply because I knew I had given too much too easily. I had made life so simple for them that they never learned struggle. And because they never struggled, they never learned respect. I began to see their calls differently. When they didn't answer, I stopped blaming their schedules. I knew now it wasn't about time. It was about value. They didn't value me anymore. They didn't think my presence mattered. They believed my love was permanent, unconditional, something that would always be there no matter how they treated me. But even unconditional love has limits when it's ignored for too long. I tried one last time to connect. I called my son one Sunday morning just to hear his voice. The phone rang and rang until finally it went to voicemail. A few minutes later, a message came. "I'll call you later." Later never came. It was a small thing, but it was enough. It was the final reminder that I no longer mattered to them. That message felt like a wall closing in. I sat there holding the phone, staring at the screen. I didn't cry, I just felt numb. That one small sentence told me everything. They would never come on their own. They would never care until something forced them to. They would only notice my absence when the comfort I provided was gone. And that thought stayed with me like a quiet truth. That moment became the reminder I needed. Not for them, but for myself. A reminder that I had allowed this neglect to grow by always giving, always forgiving. I realized I had become a servant to my own kindness. And now it was time to stop. I would not beg to be seen. I would not chase love that had turned into convenience. I would not remind them with words anymore. My next reminder would be silent, powerful, and unforgettable. I looked around my home that night. The big, empty rooms, the pictures of happier days, the trophies of my hard work. Everything I had built stood strong, except the family it was meant for. That was the saddest truth of all. But even in that sadness, I found strength. I finally understood that sometimes people forget the value of the giver until the giving stops. And soon, they were about to be reminded. Sunday morning came, quiet and slow. I woke early, made tea, and sat by the window. The phone rested on the table beside me. I had been trying all week to reach someone, anyone from my family. But no one had answered. I stared at the screen, waiting for a message that would never come. The same names, the same silence. It was strange how silence could hurt more than words. The man who once received calls every hour now sat alone, wondering when his own children had forgotten him. The last time I had spoken to my son, it was short. I had called just to say hello, to ask how everyone was doing. He had sounded distracted, rushing through the call. "I'll call you later," he said. That later never came. It was a small moment, but it was enough. Something inside me changed that day. I didn't cry or shout. I just sat there, quiet, realizing how far away my family had drifted. I looked around the house, the big rooms, the pictures on the walls, the furniture polished and still. It was all too clean, too quiet. It felt less like a home and more like a museum. Everything in it spoke of memories that no longer lived. The laughter that once filled the air had been replaced by the hum of emptiness. I thought about the time I had built that house, brick by brick, thinking it would always be full of warmth. Now, all I had was space and silence. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, the long nights spent working, the years without rest, the chances I gave up just to give my children a better future. Every coin I earned had gone to them. Every dream I chased was for them, and now they couldn't even give me a few minutes of their time. The unfairness of it burned quietly in my chest, but not with anger, just disappointment. I walked into my study and sat at my desk. The phone was still beside me, the one that had once connected me to everyone I loved. Now it was only a reminder of how alone I had become. I scrolled through my contact list, my children, their spouses, even my grandchildren. So many names, so many people. Yet not one of them had time for me. I felt like a stranger in my own family. For a while, I thought of calling again. Maybe someone would answer this time. But then I stopped myself. What was the point? I had already begged for attention without realizing it. I had lowered myself again and again just to be remembered. That wasn't love. That was habit. And habits can be broken. I looked at the phone one last time and placed it down slowly. Something inside me hardened. Enough was enough. That was the moment I decided things had to change. Not for revenge, not out of anger, but for dignity. I had spent my entire life giving without being asked. Now I would take back without warning. The same silence they had given me, I would return, only stronger. I wouldn't need to speak to be heard. I had other ways to remind them who I was. I stood up and looked at myself in the mirror. The man staring back wasn't weak. I was tired, yes, but not broken. Behind those eyes was the same strength that had built everything they now enjoyed. They had forgotten, but I hadn't. They had taken, but I still had the power to give, and to stop giving. I walked through each room of the mansion, touching the walls, the furniture, the things I had bought with my own effort. I realized something important in that moment. All of it was mine. Every key, every document, every account still carried my name. They had been living off my kindness without even knowing how much control I still had. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me calm, because now I knew exactly what I was going to do next. I sat back down, picked up my phone, and stared at it for a long moment. It had been a tool for pain, for waiting, for disappointment. But soon it would become something else, a tool for change. One phone call, that's all it would take. I smiled faintly, not with joy, but with certainty. The time for silence was over. The time for reminders had come. I sat down at my desk and opened the drawer. Inside were all the papers that held my life together. Company documents, property deeds, bank files, investment papers. Each one was a piece of what I had built with my own hands. I looked at them quietly, one by one, and realized something simple but powerful. Everything still belonged to me. Every signature on those pages was mine. Every right, every asset, every home, every car, all under my control. They had forgotten that. They had lived so long in comfort that they believed the wealth was theirs. But nothing was theirs. It was all mine. I picked up the file of my company. The same company that started in a small garage when I was young. I remembered the nights spent working, the times I slept on a chair, the times I didn't eat so that my workers could. That company grew because of me. It became the reason my family lived the way they did. My children got the best schools, the best clothes, and the best start in life because of what I had built. But now, they acted like they built it themselves. They forgot the man who stood behind every opportunity they ever had. I opened another folder, my property records. The mansion, the land, the cars, the vacation home, all in my name. They had keys, but not ownership. They used everything freely, never asking, never thinking. But one piece of paper could take it all away. I realized then that power didn't come from control. It came from awareness. They thought I was weak because I was quiet. They thought silence meant surrender. But silence can hide great strength. I had it. They didn't. The accounts were next. I went through them carefully. Every allowance I gave, every card I had approved, every monthly transfer that kept their lives running smoothly. It all came from me. Without my signature, those accounts would stop in an instant. The life they were living wasn't independent. It was borrowed. Borrowed comfort, borrowed status, borrowed pride. They had forgotten that borrowed things must always be returned. I sat back in my chair and thought about it all. For years, I had carried them on my shoulders. I had made sure none of them struggled the way I once did. I thought giving them everything would make them grateful. But it had only made them blind. They didn't respect what they didn't earn. They didn't see the difference between privilege and effort. I had given too much for too long, and now they had mistaken kindness for weakness. I looked around my study. The trophies, the awards, the framed photos of my family smiling beside my success. All those smiles were built on my hard work. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to see them hurt, but I couldn't let them continue this way. They needed to remember who made their lives possible. They needed to learn the value of gratitude before life taught them the hard way. As I went through the last folder, a calm thought settled in my mind. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to explain anything. I had the power to change everything with one simple act. I didn't need them to listen. I just needed to stop giving. The same way they had stopped caring. It wasn't about anger. It was about balance. They had taken for years. Now it was time for me to take back control. I looked at the clock. It was almost noon. The sunlight came through the window and fell on the documents spread across the desk. All that wealth, all that work. It was the result of a life built on discipline and sacrifice. I thought about how easily they had forgotten. But forgetting comes with a price. And now, that price was due. I closed the drawers carefully, locked them, and sat quietly for a moment. The decision was made. Everything I needed was already in my hands. My family had ignored my calls, avoided my words, dismissed my presence. But they couldn't ignore what they depended on. The company, the money, the mansion. It all came from me. They might have turned their backs on me, but their lives were still tied to my name. And soon they would remember exactly what that meant. I picked up the phone again, but this time it wasn't to call my family. This time it was to call someone who actually listened. My lawyer answered on the first ring. My voice was calm, steady, controlled. I gave clear instructions, one after another, like a man who had already thought everything through. There was no hesitation, no anger, just decision. I told him to stop all allowances immediately. Every account my children had access to, every transfer set on schedule, every extra card linked to my name, all of it frozen. Then came the second part. The properties that had been shared for years, the apartments, the vacation homes, the cars. All of them were to be removed from shared access. Every title, every document, every piece of ownership that carried another name was to be reviewed and corrected. I wanted my lawyer to make sure that only my name remained on every asset I owned. He paused for a moment, surprised, but did as told. I had earned everything, and it was my right to take it back. I didn't shout or explain myself. I didn't say why. I didn't need to. My silence spoke louder than any reason could. For years, I had been the provider, the protector, the foundation. They had used that foundation without respect. Now I was removing it, one signature at a time. I had given them a life of ease, but now they would taste what real life felt like. I hung up the phone and sat quietly. It was strange how one simple call could change everything. For years, I had waited for them to remember me. I had begged in silence for attention, for love. Now, I had given up on waiting. I didn't need them to call anymore. Soon, they would call me. And when they did, it would not be because they missed me. It would be because they needed me. And that was the lesson they had forced me to teach. I looked at the stack of papers in front of me. My company documents, my bank accounts, my property files. Each one carried my name. Each one carried proof that I was still in control. They had forgotten that everything they touched came from my work. They had thought my kindness was endless. They had mistaken my patience for weakness. Now, they would see that quiet people are not powerless. They just choose their moment carefully. The lawyer called back an hour later to confirm. Everything was done. All transactions were stopped, all access removed. The cards they used would no longer work. The accounts they depended on would show zero. The comfort they took for granted would vanish before they even understood what happened. I thanked the lawyer politely and ended the call. There was no joy in my voice, no satisfaction, just calm. I walked around the mansion slowly after that. Each room carried a memory. Every photo on the wall told a story of love, sacrifice, and effort. I touched the frames softly and smiled faintly. They had taken those moments for granted, but I never had. Every time they ignored me, I remembered these walls, these years, these sacrifices. And now, it was time for the house to remember too. I went out to the garden and stood in the sunlight. The world around me was quiet, peaceful. I felt no guilt. I had given them decades of love and support. What I did now wasn't revenge, it was truth. They had to learn that love without respect dies, and support without gratitude ends. Sometimes the only way to remind people of value is to take away what they depend on most. I took a deep breath and looked at the sky. The decision was done. There was no turning back. I had made one phone call, but its echo would reach far, not just through the banks and offices, but into the hearts of those who had forgotten me. They would feel the change soon, not just in their wallets, but in their lives. And when that day came, they would finally remember who built everything they once called theirs. After the call, the house stayed quiet. Nothing looked different, but everything had changed. I went about my days as usual, reading the newspaper, drinking tea, walking through the garden. But there was a stillness in the air, the kind that comes before people realize what they've lost. For years, they had called me for everything. Now the only calls that mattered were the ones they didn't know had stopped. I didn't wait for a reaction. I knew it would come soon. The first 2 days passed without a sound. No calls, no messages. I knew they hadn't noticed yet. The cards were still in their wallets, the accounts still linked to their names, but nothing was moving. I imagined the small confusion they would feel when payments didn't go through. That quiet panic when comfort starts to slip away. But I didn't think about it with satisfaction. I felt nothing but calm. On the third day, the phone began to ring. Once, then twice, then again. Unknown numbers, familiar numbers, missed calls piling up. I looked at the screen, saw their names, and let it ring. I didn't pick up. The same way they hadn't picked up my calls before. It wasn't revenge. It was reflection. They were hearing the same silence I had lived with for months. Messages started coming, short ones at first. Something's wrong. Can you call me? Did you change something? I read each one carefully, then put the phone down. No answer. The silence was my message now. I didn't need to explain what had happened. I didn't need to defend my actions. The truth was already teaching them faster than words ever could. By the end of the week, the tone of the messages changed. The pride in their words was gone. The short texts turned longer, softer. Please call me when you can. We're worried. Can we come see you? The same people who had been too busy for me now had all the time in the world. The same hands that ignored me were now reaching out in panic. I sat on my porch and watched the sunset. The sky was quiet, the same way my heart was. I didn't smile or cry. I just felt peace. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about truth. People don't value what's always there. They only notice when it's gone. My silence had become the teacher they needed. The phone kept ringing, but I didn't move. Each ring was like an echo of the past. Every unanswered call, every ignored message, every lonely night. The sound didn't hurt anymore. It just reminded me of how far I had come from the man who once begged for attention. Now, I didn't need their voices to feel alive. I looked around the house, and for the first time, I didn't feel alone. The silence that used to feel heavy now felt peaceful. It wasn't the silence of neglect anymore. It was the silence of strength. I had taken back control of my life. I had taken back my respect without shouting, without fighting. Just quiet, steady action. By the weekend, they had tried every way to reach me. Calls, emails, messages through friends, all ignored. They even sent someone from the office to check on me. I told the man politely that everything was fine. And it was. For the first time in years, everything truly was fine. I spent that weekend doing simple things, watering the plants, reading old letters, watching the birds from my balcony. Each small act felt meaningful again. I didn't need anyone's approval or company to feel complete. I had finally understood something powerful. Love should not make you small, and family should not make you lonely. The silence stretched for days, but I didn't break it. I wanted them to feel it, to live in it the way I had. The quiet was not punishment. It was a mirror. Now they would see what I had seen. Now they would know what it felt like to wait, to hope, to be ignored. The silence was my final message, the one they could no longer avoid. The silence didn't last long before the real consequences began. Within days, the first cracks appeared. My oldest son called the bank, confused about a payment that didn't go through. The card declined at a restaurant. The next day, the second card stopped working too. Bills that were always paid automatically now showed as overdue. The company cars they used were pulled back. The office accounts they depended on were frozen. The world that had always run smoothly began to slow down. My daughter tried to make rent for her apartment, but the payment bounced. The same daughter who said she was too busy to visit now had all the time in the world. She called me over and over, her voice in panic through the messages she left. The same messages I had once sent, waiting for a reply that never came. I listened to her words but didn't respond. It wasn't cruelty, it was the lesson she had earned. The younger ones tried to fix things through friends and contacts, pretending they weren't in trouble. But when money stops moving, people disappear. Their friends who once filled their lives with parties and smiles now ignored their calls. Creditors started reaching out. The comfort they lived in became heavier every day. They had built their lives around my support, and now that support was gone. They had never learned how to stand alone. One by one, they began to realize what was happening. The cars were repossessed. The staff they employed stopped showing up. The lifestyle they showed off to others fell apart. It wasn't just about money, it was about dependency. For the first time, they saw how much of their world came from me. Not just my wealth, but my care, my planning, my presence. They had built their lives on the idea that I would always be there, always providing. Now they saw how fragile that idea was. I didn't check on them. I didn't ask how they were managing. I stayed quiet. I went on with my daily life, calm, peaceful, unbothered. Every morning I walked through my mansion, looking out at the garden, reading the news, drinking tea. The same peace that once felt empty now felt earned. I wasn't waiting for them anymore. I had waited enough. My phone filled with messages, some angry, some desperate, some pretending nothing had happened. Please call me. Why did you do this? We need to talk. I didn't reply to any of them. They had been too busy when I needed them. Now, I was too quiet for their noise. The same silence they gave me had come back around, only this time, it wasn't neglect. It was balance. Days turned into a week. They tried to survive on their own, but it didn't last. None of them knew how to handle real life. They were too used to easy answers and open doors. I had raised them with love, but I had also raised them with too much comfort. And now, that comfort had turned into weakness. Their friends began to whisper. Their social circle started to shrink. Without the money, without the image, they were no longer important to anyone. They learned quickly how the world treats people who can't pay. It was harsh, but it was real. They had never seen this side of life before. It humbled them. It made them think. It made them remember. Meanwhile, I continued my days in peace. I wasn't smiling or celebrating. I wasn't proud. I was simply calm. The lesson had started, and I didn't need to interfere. Life was doing the work for me. For years, they had ignored my words. Now, they were learning through experience. And experience is a teacher that never forgets. At night, I sat on my porch and thought about them. I wondered if they were eating well, if they were angry, if they understood what I was trying to say without words. I didn't want them to suffer. I wanted them to see. To see how love turns into emptiness when it's not respected. To see how fast life changes when you take kindness for granted. The silence had started the change. The consequences were finishing it. The man who once felt powerless now had peace. The family that once felt untouchable now had humility. That was the price of forgetting who built their world. And soon, they would come to my door, not for money, but for forgiveness. The silence didn't last long before the real consequences began. Within days, the first cracks appeared. My oldest son called the bank, confused about a payment that didn't go through. The card declined at a restaurant. The next day, the second card stopped working too. Bills that were always paid automatically now showed as overdue. The company cars they used were pulled back. The office accounts they depended on were frozen. The world that had always run smoothly began to slow down. My daughter tried to make rent for her apartment, but the payment bounced. The same daughter who said she was too busy to visit now had all the time in the world. She called me over and over, her voice in panic through the messages she left. The same messages I had once sent, waiting for a reply that never came. I listened to her words but didn't respond. It wasn't cruelty. It was the lesson she had earned. The younger ones tried to fix things through friends and contacts, pretending they weren't in trouble. But when money stops moving, people disappear. Their friends who once filled their lives with parties and smiles now ignored their calls. Creditors started reaching out. The comfort they lived in became heavier every day. They had built their lives around my support, and now that support was gone. They had never learned how to stand alone. One by one, they began to realize what was happening. The cars were repossessed. The staff they employed stopped showing up. The lifestyle they showed off to others fell apart. It wasn't just about money, it was about dependency. For the first time, they saw how much of their world came from me. Not just my wealth, but my care, my planning, my presence. They had built their lives on the idea that I would always be there, always providing. Now they saw how fragile that idea was. I didn't check on them. I didn't ask how they were managing. I stayed quiet. I went on with my daily life. Calm, peaceful, unbothered. Every morning I walked through my mansion, looking out at the garden, reading the news, drinking tea. The same peace that once felt empty now felt earned. I wasn't waiting for them anymore. I had waited enough. My phone filled with messages, some angry, some desperate, some pretending nothing had happened. Please call me. Why did you do this? We need to talk. I didn't reply to any of them. They had been too busy when I needed them. Now, I was too quiet for their noise. The same silence they gave me had come back around, only this time, it wasn't neglect. It was balance. Days turned into a week. They tried to survive on their own, but it didn't last. None of them knew how to handle real life. They were too used to easy answers and open doors. I had raised them with love, but I had also raised them with too much comfort. And now, that comfort had turned into weakness. Their friends began to whisper. Their social circles started to shrink. Without the money, without the image, they were no longer important to anyone. They learned quickly how the world treats people who can't pay. It was harsh, but it was real. They had never seen this side of life before. It humbled them. It made them think. It made them remember. Meanwhile, I continued my days in peace. I wasn't smiling or celebrating. I wasn't proud. I was simply calm. The lesson had started, and I didn't need to interfere. Life was doing the work for me. For years, they had ignored my words. Now, they were learning through experience. And experience is a teacher that never forgets. At night, I sat on my porch and thought about them. I wondered if they were eating well, if they were angry, If they understood what I was trying to say without words. I didn't want them to suffer. I wanted them to see. To see how love turns into emptiness when it's not respected. To see how fast life changes when you take kindness for granted. The silence had started the change. The consequences were finishing it. The man who once felt powerless now had peace. The family that once felt untouchable now had humility. That was the price of forgetting who built their world. And soon they would come to my door, not for money, but for forgiveness. I waited a long time before I finally stood up. The sun was lower in the sky, and the voices outside had grown quiet. I walked slowly to the front door, my steps steady, my face calm. The security guard opened the gate as I approached, and the noise began again, my family rushing toward me, speaking all at once, their faces full of fear and guilt. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move quickly. I just looked at them, silent, the same way they had once been silent with me. They stopped talking when they saw my eyes. There was no anger there, no hate, just calm truth. They looked small now, all of them. The same people who had once said they were too busy to visit were now standing together, waiting for my words. I didn't speak right away. I let the moment breathe. The silence between us felt heavy, but it carried years of meaning. They understood now that my quiet was not weakness. It was power. I looked at each of them, one by one. My son, who had ignored my calls. My daughter, who had forgotten my birthdays. My grandchildren, who didn't even know what my voice sounded like anymore. They all stood there, unable to look me in the eye for long. For the first time, they saw me not as an old man who needed them, but as the man who had built everything they had ever known. I asked one question, my voice low and even. Busy now? The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had done. No one answered. The sound of the wind in the garden was louder than their voices. They looked down, their shame clear. The same people who once spoke loudly about their success now stood silent in defeat. They knew I didn't need to yell. The truth had already spoken. I didn't lecture them. I didn't explain what they had done wrong. They already knew. I turned slightly and looked at the mansion behind me, the big, beautiful house that stood because of me. The house they had lived in, laughed in, used as a symbol of wealth and pride. Now it looked different to them. It wasn't theirs. It never had been. And now, standing outside its gate, they finally understood that. One of them tried to speak, but no words came. Their voices broke under the weight of guilt. I didn't stop them, didn't comfort them. I just stood there, quiet and still, letting them feel the truth fully. Sometimes silence teaches better than any speech ever could. They had ignored my pain. Now they were feeling their own. I took a step forward and looked at the road beyond the gate. Cars passed, people stared. The world continued like nothing had changed. But for my family, everything had. They had lost something they could never buy back. My trust. I turned back to them, my expression still calm. I called many times. I said softly. You were too busy. Now I am. I turned around and walked back toward the mansion. Each step was slow, steady, final. They called after me, their voices breaking, begging, pleading. But I didn't stop. The same way they hadn't stopped their lives when I was waiting on the phone for them. The door closed behind me with a soft sound. It wasn't loud, but it felt heavy, the kind of sound that ends a chapter. Inside, the house was quiet again. I stood in the hallway, listening to the echoes fade. Outside, my family remained by the gate, still calling, still hoping. But I didn't open the door again. I didn't need to. I had done enough. The man who once begged for time now owned it completely. The silence they had given me had come full circle. I went back to my chair, sat down, and looked out the window once more. The garden was calm, the sky dimming with evening light. I felt no anger, only peace. They had learned their lesson, not through shouting, not through punishment, but through truth. They would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. I didn't need to say more. Sometimes, one simple act, one quiet decision, and one short question are enough to change everything. After that day, things changed. The house stayed quiet, but my heart was lighter. I didn't wait for phone calls anymore. I didn't look at the gate hoping to see anyone there. I had accepted what life had shown me. Love without respect becomes pain, and silence can teach more than words ever will. My family's lesson had begun, and now it was time for my peace. In the days that followed, the begging turned into silence. They stopped coming to the gate. The calls slowed down, then stopped. I knew they were ashamed, maybe afraid to face me again. But I also knew they were thinking, really thinking, for the first time in years. They had seen how quickly comfort disappears when gratitude is lost. They had learned that wealth built on someone else's kindness is never truly theirs. I didn't celebrate their downfall. I didn't want them to suffer. I only wanted them to remember who made their lives possible. Sometimes love needs distance to be understood. Sometimes care needs to disappear before it's seen. I had given them everything, money, a home, a name, but now I had given them something far more valuable, truth. Every morning, I sat on the porch with my tea, looking at the sunrise. The garden bloomed quietly. The birds came as always. I thought about my family, but not with anger anymore. I hoped they were learning, rebuilding, growing stronger. I didn't want them to depend on me forever. I wanted them to understand how to stand on their own. That was the lesson life had brought full circle. I looked around my mansion and felt peace. Every corner reminded me of hard work and sacrifice. Every wall stood as proof that effort builds what laziness destroys. I had spent years giving and giving, believing love meant never saying no. But now, I saw the truth. Love also means knowing when to stop. It means protecting your heart, not just giving it away. Weeks later, my son came quietly one evening. No car, no fancy clothes, no attitude, just humility. He didn't ask for money. He only said he wanted to talk. I listened. The words were simple. Sorry, thank you, I was wrong. That was all I needed to hear. I didn't reply with anger. I just nodded and said, "It's all right." In that small moment, something healed. Not the past, but the understanding. After that, the visits became less about need and more about presence. They started calling not for help, but to ask how I was doing. The same voices that once ignored me now wanted to listen. It wasn't about the mansion or the money anymore. It was about connection. The lesson had worked, quietly but completely. I didn't change the documents back. The will stayed as it was. The mansion remained in my name. It wasn't out of punishment. It was a reminder. A reminder that love and respect must come before inheritance. I didn't want my family to love me for what I owned. I wanted them to love me for who I was. And now, for the first time in years, I felt they finally did. I looked at the sky one evening, the light fading behind the trees, and smiled softly. Life had been long and full of lessons. I had learned that giving without limits turns blessings into burdens. I had learned that silence can speak louder than anger. Most of all, I had learned that people change only when life forces them to. And sometimes, all it takes is one phone call to make that change begin. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the gate. It was closed now, but it didn't feel like a wall anymore. It felt like peace. My family had found their way back, and so had I. I had finally learned the greatest truth. Love given freely should never be taken for granted, and respect is the only inheritance worth leaving behind.